joined all the live streams. So let's get the show on the road. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will continue to celebrate Pride Month by discussing the work of CenterLink with special guests, Denise Spivak, Executive Director of CenterLink, and Robert Boo, Co-Chair of the Board at CenterLink and Executive Director of the Pride Center at Equity Park in South Florida. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we'll take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you very much for joining us, Denise. Thank you, Robert. And you know, I just want to set you up. I'm gonna go to you, Denise. CenterLink is an international organization, and it's an association of LGBTQ plus community centers and other organizations with over 270 members. And I was interviewing Diego Sanchez of PFLAG the other day, and when I asked him about the state of LGBTQ plus rights, he answered, well, it depends on your zip code. And it seems the community centers, they're zip code based. So could you just give us a state of affairs in terms of the community centers and how they have navigated COVID and where they stand today coming out of this pandemic?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you interviewed Diego. I love him. He's one of my favorite people. So
amazing guy.
He really is. He's done amazing things at PFLAG too. So community centers have done a phenomenal job of navigating the pandemic, and it's at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were talking about this before we went live. I think for everybody, it was this pause of, well, what are we going to do now? Like, what's our next move? And for community centers that are walk-in facilities that provide on-site services, it was really, how do we not leave our community behind? How do we provide that same support and those same resources without opening our doors? And so we opened our virtual doors, and our community centers pivoted on a dime. They learned how to use Zoom. Our youth centers learned how to use things like Discord. A program that we have that we do with the community centers called Q Chat Space, which is a virtual program. They all exploded, and people, it was everything from figuring out how to do those online support sessions so that they still gave that same sort of support, and also in some cases having to teach people how to use the technology in order to be able to use that support. So aside from that, a lot of our centers expanded their clothing closets. They started food pantry programs if they didn't already have them. For the centers that did medical programs, whether it was HIV testing or in-person medical services, they had to figure out how to do those. So it was, in some cases, pre-scheduled, one person at a time, nobody else in the building. So it was really a tour de force for our centers to figure out how to be that same heart of the community, but do it in a very different way.
It's kind of a teachable moment, isn't it? A crisis sort of brings people together. Robert, when you take a look at community centers, and you run a community center, you have been in this movement for a long time. Could you talk a little bit about the functions and the changing functions of the community centers within different communities? How do you experience the needs of the community, and how do you serve the community in different ways?
Sure. So each community center is very unique. Out of the 270, there's probably not one that is an exact copy of another one, because it does depend on the zip code of what services, programs, what other service providers are in that area. So for example, we're very fortunate. I'm located in Wilton Manors, which is Fort Lauderdale, South Florida. So we are not an aid service organization, because there are other organizations, sister organizations in our community that provide that. So it doesn't make sense for us to duplicate the service or try to take funding when funding is already so tight. It doesn't make sense to take that funding away, try to fight for it for someone else's sister organization. So each community center has to look at what are the gaps in their community. And again, we consider ourselves Switzerland. We get along with everyone. We collaborate with everyone. We link people to resources and services within the community that we don't provide directly. And so that's why each community center is very unique. We have the LA Center, which is the largest LGBT organization in the world that provides everything.
Right.
And then we have other organizations, other centers that are servicing small rural communities. And so their program, their footprint, their look is going to be very different.
So let's traverse this world. If you're talking in a small community, and where there are not that many services, there are a number of different elements that generally will comprise a community center. There's there's the issue of having a safe space, safe emotionally, away from trauma, away from lack of acceptance, finding acceptance, right? Then there's the whole issue of information exchange. You mentioned, Robert, that you don't provide AIDS services. But other organizations do, right? What other, in the small community centers that are remote outside of urban centers, Denise, what kind of service patterns do you see in those institutions?
You know, again, Mark, as Robert said, there's really no one footprint. Rural areas are a lot harder to navigate. You know, to even put up a building that would say, or an office that would say LGBT on the window in some places can be a very frightening thing, and potentially no one would come.
Right.
So in those cases, it might be that they have an office somewhere. They might be located in a church basement, or in the back of another facility, where it's not always so much about the building, it's about the services. So in a lot of cases, rural centers are doing a lot of work with schools. They're doing a lot of work trying to find medical providers who will provide services to the LGBT community. So it really, it depends on the location. There are other rural areas where they do have a location and they do events and they do prides. It just really, it's going to depend on safety and the whole atmosphere, if you will, of the locale.
Well, you're making a really important point. If you take a look at the traditional concept of a community centers were basically social gathering points. But when it comes to the LGBTQ plus movement, right, you've got here a political issue. You have a safety issue. You have dealing with shame and stigma issue. It's self-identity issues, right? You have a much more complicated operating environment than a YMCA does, or some community center. In a sense, you have to think about a lot more when you decide to set up a community center. And so the character is different. How do you staff, Robert, in terms of when you look as the chair of the board, as you look at your fellow center directors, do you find that character creates different competencies that need to be embedded in these organizations in order to serve the community adequately?
Absolutely, because when you look at the LGBT community, it really is one of the broadest communities across the whole spectrum of race, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, the whole gamut. So we're a very diverse group. Age, youth versus active agers. We don't call them seniors, because now that I'm one, we're active agers. Our programs, our environment that we provide for that safe space looks very different depending upon where you are. Here in South Florida, I'm very fortunate. Wilton Manors is the second gayest city per capita in the United States. I realize that I'm in a bubble, but if I go to Iowa or, some rural area, my whole portfolio of services and the whole look and how out we may be is going to look totally different.
It's really interesting. The point that you're making is that even if you're talking about cultural reference points, right? Depending on where you live, where you're located, the cultural reference points can be incredibly diverse because orientation doesn't run according to a particular culture or religion or a particular race or a particular age or whatever, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to satisfy the needs across a broad cultural landscape. Denise, when you look at the leadership that you have, does the leadership, the staff, does it reflect that diversity in society? We see so many institutions that are, and we're having a reckoning in this country, white dominated or male dominated or whatever. How do you, as you look across the board landscape and the staff landscape, are there changes that are required in order to meet the needs of the moment?
There are changes that are necessary, but I would say that that the changes are probably one of the larger challenges that our centers face, and I would probably argue that we're not alone in this in the nonprofit world, but boards still tend to be about 65% white. The staff is probably the most reflective level of the community. But once we move into leadership, and I'm happy to say the tide is turning on that as well. We're starting to see many more leaders representing different races and communities. But we still have a challenge here. We still have a challenge with leadership and board leadership to be truly reflective of our communities. And we're working on it.
Incidentally, we just completed a poll, and this is a rather select group. Only a third of the individuals who responded to this poll said that they've been involved with any community, LGBTQ plus community center. Are you finding that recruiting people to join your community, Robert, is at all a challenge? And Denise, are you finding that we're getting to the point where in urban centers, the situation has shifted so much that an LGBTQ plus community center is no longer the value proposition that it was earlier? How do you see it, Robert?
Well, I'm smiling because I remember very specifically when marriage equality was passed. People that were physically around me were like, oh, okay, now our work is done. And I actually had one of my donors look at me and said, well, I just don't think, LGBT community centers are going to be needed in the future because we just got marriage equality and now everything is wonderful and rosy. And I looked at him and I went, really? So all of those JCCs, all of those African-American community centers, I went down the long list, said people will always want to be able to have a safe space with individuals, like-minded individuals. And just because we got marriage equality doesn't mean all of the work that we have to do goes away. And then all of our community members, your question about recruiting community members to be involved in centers, I can speak specifically for me. We service thousands, over 35,000 people a year on our campus pre-COVID. We would have 1,000 to 2,000 people step foot on our campus on a daily basis. So we're very fortunate. We have 5 buildings, 35,000 square feet of meeting and office space. And at night, that office space is filled, those meeting rooms are filled with groups, organizations that go the whole gamut of support groups, social groups, activities, political groups, the ballet and opera club. It's a whole gamut of brother speak. So people still want to get together. They still want to congregate. They still want that safe space. And like I said, we're very fortunate to have the 5.5-acre campus that we do, but that's not common.
So you're a service provider to other nonprofits and to other organizations in your community.
Correct. When we purchased our 5.5-acre campus back in 2009, our concept was to create a campus of care, multiple services, multiple organizations, so someone could come onto our campus and see a number of service providers. It wasn't just about us.
And Denise, as you look at other organizations, are you finding that the centers are also functioning as alliance builders with other nonprofit organizations, with other members of the communities?
Very, very frequent.
And service providers?
Yeah, absolutely. The centers are not only hubs for the community, but often are hubs, or I should say, not just for community members, but often for the community as a whole. And even in some states, not even communities. I mean, we have centers that are often the only LGBT representation in the entire state. So they are building alliances throughout the state to provide awareness and services. And I will say during COVID, in many cases, it was the centers that were still doing things, that were still providing for the community when other agencies were not able to. So through COVID, possibly even more so than they always are.
Do you find that through these alliances, you're able to extend your programs and services out further than you would if you were acted solo?
I could say yes at the national level. And we spend a lot of time working with partner agencies to provide programming opportunities, sign-on opportunities, advocacy opportunities. And I'll let Robert talk to more of the local level.
Sure. And in our particular case, well, with COVID, by the second week, we shut down March 18th of 2020. And by the second week, we took everything virtual. And we have the nation's largest weekly gathering of LGBT active agers. And so it actually expanded, going virtual expanded our reach. So we would have like over 200 active agers every Tuesday morning attend our program. But when we went virtual, we were having thousands of people from all over the country watch our Facebook Live events. And so we switched to 4 days a week doing Facebook Live updates. Every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Every Wednesday during the pandemic, what's behind me is the state of Florida's first LGBT-focused senior affordable and supportive housing. And so construction was deemed essential. And so I physically gave updates and walking tours every Wednesday so people could see the progress that was still going on, because people were starving for good news, because we were all hunkered down. We were all scared, nervous about what was going on. We didn't know how it was being transmitted at first. And so this was a way to still stay connected to the community, let them know that the work was still going on, and then see some good news, know that this was still going on.
When these community centers started up, and they go back 30, 40 years.
50.
50 years.
50.
Thank you for the correction.
Sure.
So they started off, it was a bunch of young folks. Now we're talking about a much more diverse audience. How does your constituencies skew in terms of age ranges?
I can speak nationally, and I can say it again depends where you are. We have centers that are solely youth focused, and then we have centers that span all age ranges. Interestingly enough, you're talking about the history of centers. That the original LGBT community centers were bars. They were the place that people gathered and found safe space and support and camaraderie, and out of that was born the first center, which is the Los Angeles Center, followed by so many after that. But I think, the biggest thing that we tell people who want to start centers is to do the community needs assessment to find out who wants, needs, and will support a center. And so for that reason, it will depend with each center who they focus on, what their constituency really will be. And really our centers serve those in need. And primarily LGBT, but if somebody shows up on the doorstep, there's no test. We don't ID them. I mean, we serve people who need to be served.
So we just completed a poll, and we asked what are the greatest needs among members of the LGBTQ plus community. And interesting, we had the same number of people who said no different from other communities. And then we had a response of support for advocacy and advocacy for legal rights. The largest group of responders said counseling and tactical support in dealing with society's dysfunction. Robert, let's talk about the last element, dealing with society's dysfunction. I mean, the whole issue of having one person not accepting another person for whoever they are, for whatever basis, right? Race, gender, orientation. It just seems to me to be kind of incomprehensible. When you look at those kinds of programs where you're helping to change how people interact, how do you create intersectionality at your center?
Well, I'm just going to use a very recent and timely situation that just occurred here in the state of Florida. The governor just signed, and it's the 12th state in the country to sign an anti-trans sports bill. And it's now a law in Florida preventing young girls and women from competing in sports in grade school, middle school, high school, and college. So we are in essence now, the state is telling any trans youth that they cannot be their authentic self, that they are less than everyone else, that they can't compete in sports, and they either have to go stealth and hide their true authentic self or have to give up sports altogether.
Now,
So,
is it just people transitioning in one direction, or is it either way?
well, this particular law was for trans girls, trans women. And even though they were citing a case that was in Connecticut, and there was only 12 known cases in the state of Florida, why waste the time and effort to put in a law that hasn't been an issue? These are children.
Well, it's creating stigma, right?
Yes, absolutely.
That's basically what's going on. If there's not a problem, it's basically sending a signal. And so and what is the signal that can be sent, right? It's basically creating stigma.
It's the first time in 27 years that Florida passed that was anti-LGBT. So it's like we're taking a step back.
So how do you deal with that from the center's perspective? You're in Florida, you're seeing this law. We were talking about intersectionality. How do you create the awareness amongst people who don't really think about this issue on a daily basis?
Right. So it does require getting the whole community, all the L's, the B's, the G's, all together to help support our brothers and sisters of trans and non-binary existence. So we have to build that support. We have to provide that safe space and let them know that we are here to back them up, to be a part of the fight here and be visible, because trans youth may not be able to be visible. So those of us that can, we need to be there. We need to be out there. We need to build the allies. And overwhelmingly, people are opposed to these type of laws. It is strictly at the upper level of lawmakers that are making these decisions for red meat to their base.
Is what you're saying is that as safety increases for someone who is gay or lesbian, the Bs, as you point out, and for people like me, right? I'm hetero, right? So is what is required that we become educators and advocates, and if we are now safe, whether we're safe as someone who is Black or a woman or someone who is Jewish or whatever, we become engaged in this idea of making it safe for others. Is that basically the point here, Robert?
Correct, because once they start chipping away and going after the marginalized communities, it will continue to grow and erode. And I'm trying to remember the preacher's name when I went through Yad Vashem in Israel. First they came for this group and I did nothing, and then they came for this group and I did nothing, and then they came to me and for me, and no one was there to protect me. So we've got to be there to protect, because it's going to erode and start taking back the equality that everyone should have.
Yeah, it was Martin Niemöller, and he was an anti-Semite, and then he saw what was going on. Denise, do you find that in the greater group of 270 organizations that are part of CenterLink, that this sensibility is dominant, or is this something that only a few people believe?
Oh, no, absolutely. And just by virtue of being an LGBT organization, we are advocates. But the important thing for us to remember, Robert touched on this at the very beginning, was that we intersect virtually every other community. And so we have a population of people that not only face one oppression or marginalization, they face multiple in many cases. And so it's so important for us to be aware, not only within the LGBTQ plus community, but also within the African-American community, within the Asian American community. Trans women of color are murdered at a rate that is so far higher than any other group. And it's something that all of our centers are having to not only, commemorate the people that have passed, that have been murdered, but to make everybody aware that this is happening, to make everybody aware, as Robert was saying, of inequality, legal inequality. So it's constant education, it's constant awareness, and that hopefully starts to turn minds and hearts and change the tide.
And if you look at it, it's not politics at all. It's really about a civil society. What kind of America do we want to have? And, there needs to be room for people. Let's say I really, really, really did not believe in people who have a different orientation than me, right? The real question is, can I accept it? Can I basically respect the ideas that people can be different? And I think that just talking about this type of topic here today is so important. I'd like to thank you both for helping us to understand the world of community centers. Denise, thank you so much for sharing your work as the executive director of CenterLink, and Robert, your work as the chair and the head of the Pride Center at Equality Park. It's just invaluable for you to unpack a little bit for us. Denise, can you just see us out? What do you want these organizations to achieve over the next couple of years as we look into the future?
Just continuing to provide that safe, welcoming space for their communities, and that means their whole communities, and that hopefully we do increase awareness. We do help to change hearts and minds and create a better society.
Robert, you want to weigh in?
Just to duplicate what Denise said, is we are there to provide that safe space. So everyone can be their authentic self and not have to hide, not have to worry about stigma, shame, guilt, etc.
How about an objective of relaxed equality? Thank you so much. Everybody have a great day. Thank you, attendees, for coming and helping out, and everyone stay safe.